Based on the Miami Dolphins' interest in Odell Beckham Jr., it can be safe to assume the Dolphins are still looking to add to their wide receiver room. How does the 2024 NFL Draft prospects at the position stack up specifically for Miami? We have our final wide receiver rankings here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find the shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Tip of the cap to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. It's $150 win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. My timeline this weekend has been littered on social media with the offensive line at 21 versus wide receiver at 21. I guess turf wars. There's a lot of people that, as we get closer and closer to this NFL draft, feel very passionately about which side of the fence they feel Miami should invest that first pick into. Me, I'm team draft good players. You know, it could be offensive lineman, it could be a wide receiver, it could be a tight end, it could be a safety, specifically Cooper DeJean if they go that route. But regardless of who they pick, they're going to have a lot of good options. And now that I'm deep enough into my scouting of the prospects, wanted to drop some final position rankings, kind of go over day two options, favorite day three players at each position, kind of go through the pecking order and how I view the players, specifically those at the top of the list, and kind of just put my flag in the ground and say, look, these are the names that I think are very logical for the Dolphins. These are the ranges which I have them coveted versus the ranges they're expected to go. You'd be looking for an intersection of appropriate value for where you'd actually be able to draft them versus how I have them stacked up on my board. So no surprises with the top three. And we've done the deep dives on a lot of these wide receivers already. We're going to do offensive line next with our next episode here on Locked On Dolphins. We'll do tackles and interior together. I also dropped that full list over on Touchdown Miami. My long-form Miami Dolphins content is available on Substack at Touchdown Miami. That full list is already out over there. But we'll get into that list and those rankings as well. That's over 30 offensive linemen. I've done over 20 wide receivers in total. And it's if you needed the affirmation that this is an outstanding wide receiver class, I did 24 wide receivers in total. I have 16 that would be currently better as they currently exist based off of how I grade it than the Dolphins' third wide receiver on the roster. So you have 16 upgrade opportunities, and you won't sniff all of those players because my top three are Marvin Harrison Jr. from Ohio State, Malik Nabers from LSU, and Rome Odunze from Washington. I have top 10 overall grades on both Harrison and Nabers. I have a very, very, very high, like true first round, but not authentically a top 10 grade on Rome Odunze. So in a perfect world, you're picking for, in a vacuum, what would be appropriate value for those players. And they're top of the draft guys, right? And they're the consensus top three. But beyond that is where things get interesting. I think for Miami specifically, you do get off the beaten path a little bit with the next tier of wide receivers, but there's a block of, 8 guys that I think are very closely bunched together. There's a significant step down from the top three, but these would be the kinds of players that you're talking about at 21 or as a part of a trade down situation if you wanted to get more picks and then make your first pick and felt wide receiver was the best available player at that stage. My fourth wide receiver specifically for the Dolphins is Ricky Pearsall from Florida. Formerly of Arizona State. So for those of you who are concerned about the Florida Gators helmet and the history of wide receiver heritage at Florida, rest easy. He's originally a Sun Devil. Brandon Ayuk from Arizona State. So a little bit better track record there. I don't really believe in helmet scouting. Relax. But Ricky Pearsall and Xavier Legette from South Carolina round out my top 5 wide receivers for the Dolphins. And I put Ricky Pearsall and Xavier Legette at 4 and 5. Little bit different skill sets. They're both very explosive players. Legette's a little bit more of a perimeter and scheme touch guy. Pearsall is a little bit more of a Morpheus inside-outside type receiver who can win in the slot and can win on the perimeter. Pearsall, I think, is probably a little bit better in the intermediate and shorter areas of the field, where Legette is more vertically dynamic, explosive, wins more of the 50-50 balls down the field, a little bit bigger catch radius in my eyes for Xavier Legette as well. But that group is not the consensus of Brian Thomas and A.D. Mitchell. I think both of those guys bring a run after catch element that A.D. Mitchell and Brian Thomas don't. And Brian Thomas and A.D. Mitchell are both in the second tier behind the big three. But they rank, because of the run after catch elements of their game, they rank towards the bottom of this second tier. As far as Ricky Pearsall and Xavier Legette, I think those two, in addition to the bottom of the tier 2, so half of the 8 players in tier 2, which are Brian Thomas and A.D. Mitchell, those guys, predictively, if you want a shot at them, it needs to be in the first round. Thomas and Mitchell are kind of consensus first-round players. Legette, I can see sneaking his way in based on all the teams that need wide receivers, and Pearsall is kind of my pick for kind of sleeper-ish top 40 pick. So that's for Miami. It's not like you can come back around the horn a second time and have those players waiting for you at 55. Now, there's always an unpredictable element of the draft. You never know who's going to slide, why they're going to slide. So it could happen. But if I were to just round out the top 10, and then I'll include the last player in the second tier because there's so many in that tier. The top 3, Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze. Rounding out the top 5, the top of tier 2 is Ricky Pearsall, Xavier Legette. I have Ladd McConkey from Georgia next. Outstanding route runner, maybe the best route runner of this entire group. And then I have Roman Wilson, slot type receiver from Michigan. Xavier Worthy from Texas. Jermaine Burton from Alabama. Brian Thomas and A.D. Mitchell. That's the top 11 players. But that whole block, I would not be surprised if the only player available at 55 out of that group is Jermaine Burton, and Jermaine Burton has some reported off-the-field questions. He's been to a lot of different programs. He's kind of pinballed around. I believe the book out there that's been reported is there's some maturity questions with Jermaine Burton, but that's a player whose ability to win vertically down the field, average depth of target is over 20 yards downfield, just electric tape for Jermaine Burton. Now, I can't fairly gauge one way or another. So when I rank them on the board, I'm going to rank them off the things that I can tangibly grade you on, which is your athletic profile, your production, and what the tape says about you as a player. But there's an asterisk next to that name. Don't be surprised if that one slides. In the same way that Darnell Washington last year was my top-ranked tight end, but there was the asterisk of, hey, I've heard the medicals aren't great here. Lo and behold, he slides to the third round, end of the third round. Same kind of asterisk going next to Jermaine Burton for a different reason. But those are 11 total wide receivers that I think would step in on day one and be better than the current third wide receiver on the Dolphins roster. And I got more names than that. Like, I've got a tier 3 of another 5 guys who I think would be better than what Miami currently has as their third wide receiver. So that's really the fascinating part of this conversation. But the vast majority of tier 1 and tier 2, in the order that I have these 11 players ranked, you're going to get one crack at. Unless you were to get really aggressive from 55 and move up, giving up 2025 draft capital to get that deal done because you don't have the other capital in 2024. So consider that a part of your opportunity cost is you're assessing how Miami chooses to attack 21 versus potentially a free agency move that allows them to go in a different direction, or potentially a trade down scenario, or potentially a trade up scenario, right? There's so many layers that go into every single decision on every single player. I'm like, yo, who do we pick? That makes it very, very difficult. And we We're going to continue into tier 3 wide receivers, players that I think could step in and still be the third wide receiver on the Dolphins roster. That is up next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. So stick with us. Passion, drive, and patience are not just the formula for winning championships. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's guaranteed fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you are burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it is easy to make your car the MVP and bring home the dub. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay guaranteed fit available only to U.S. customers. Like this wide receiver class a lot. And it's not an uncommon theme when you consider the way that wide receiver play in college football has evolved. But nevertheless, you just really reiterate the amount of talent that is here. It's almost like paralyzing because there's so many different options with so many different body types and kinds of players. Tier 3 for me, Malachi Corley is my wide receiver 12 for Miami. Have a third-round grade on Malachi Corley. The other players up till this point were top 10s, first round, and early second round type grades. Just based off of, again, film, athletic profile, production. Film obviously carrying the majority of the weight here. We are grading these players specifically against the kinds of things that the Dolphins value: separation, run after catch, route running ability, blocking skills. Those are all kind of notable premier traits that I'm grading. And what's fun is I'm taking these players and then I'm putting the Dolphins players through the same rankings, so that you can get up on the board and you can visually see, here's where Tyreek Hill ranks, here's where Jalen Waddle ranks. Then I have Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze. They would be considered like quality starters from the jump based off their projection to the league. Then you get into some adequate level starters with the tier 2 guys. Now you're getting into adequate level starters / probably quality depth expectations. Once you get this deep in, which is your tier 3 guys, which are kind of your players you think are third round options for you. Malachi Corley leads that list because, again, you're looking at run after catch and blocking skills. And Corley, with as physical as he is, as a bigger body player, and having the run after catch resume that he does, is one of the best run after catch guys in the league. He just doesn't have the route running prowess. And there's some bigger issues with hands that drop him to the next tier below all the guys that we've discussed up till this point. Now, the next guy might be a day 3 guy when it's all said and done. So I'm not going to talk too much about him because I want to give him his time in the sun when we get to day 3 favorites. But Malik Washington from Virginia, another diminutive player. You wish it was a little bit bigger, but explosive, slippery, fast, tough. A lot to like with Malik Washington from Virginia. He checks in front of Jalen McMillan from Washington, Keon Coleman from Florida State, and then Jalen Polk, the third wide receiver from Washington. All 5 of those players checking in front of Eric Ezukanma as he grades out for Miami. Now, I also have a couple other players that are in this tier. They just don't stack above what Ezukanma currently ranks in the Dolphins offense. And the traits that I'm using to evaluate the prospects in the draft. So I would consider this probably tier 4. So you have 3 guys in tier 1, technically 2 guys in tier 1, and then 1 in tier 2, because technically Harrison Jr. and Neighbors are a tier above Odunze for me. But we'll put them all together for the simplicity of the conversation. 3 in tier 1, you have 8 in tier 2. Some of those you expect there potentially to be holdovers that would be available at 55, but the vast majority of those you'd have to be strategic if you want to swing the bat there. The guys at tier 3, Corley, Washington, McMillan, Coleman, and Polk. Coleman may go earlier. I wouldn't be surprised if he slides a little bit just because there's some separation questions there. Kind of played out of place in Florida State last year. The big thing with him that's the selling point is the GPS, like time playing speed versus his actual time speed. He ran the 4.6s as a big body wide receiver. So there's some concern about separation in the intermediate areas of the field and in the shorter areas of the field. But the selling point there, and the reason why I do think he probably goes higher, is because he's super physical and his GPS timing is high. You should be rooting, though, in my mind, because I have Coleman ranked below guys like Thomas and Mitchell and Worthy and Wilson and McConkey and Leggett and Pierce. I have all those guys ranked in front of Keon Coleman. You as a Dolphins fan should be rooting for Keon Coleman to go as early off the board as possible as a player who gets projected in the first round, because the domino effect is that potentially kicks another wide receiver we have ranked higher closer to being available when Miami picks next, assuming they don't go wide receiver with their first pick, if that makes sense. My tier 4 guys are guys that I have in the same tier of expectations as far as being like quality depth players, but not necessarily super high volume players from the jump. I don't think it would eliminate the need for you to come out and get a veteran wide receiver that can contribute if you wanted to hedge against Ezukanma. But Tez Walker from North Carolina is in this group. Brendan Rice from USC is in this group. That's Jerry's son, if you're into football lineage and bloodlines. Troy Franklin, a little bit lower on than the consensus. He's in this group as well. And then Javon Baker. You told me these guys go late day 2. Would not be surprised for any of them. Tez Walker's kind of the long strider, vertical, plane type guy. Brendan Rice is your prototypical X. Would be a great blocker for Miami. Possession style receiver, contested catch player. Doesn't run blazing fast like Walker or Franklin do. Troy Franklin is a similar to Tez Walker, but just a smaller player, vertical plane style player. I think you could break these guys down into subgroups, and Franklin would be certainly a part of that like stereotypical Z receiver. I wouldn't play him in the slot. He'd be an outside only guy, wins vertically down the field, tracks the ball pretty well, just has some frustrating drops. Don't think he runs an overly nuanced route tree. And then the last player in tier 4 is Javon Baker from the University of Florida. Baker gives me and I know I mentioned this on the mock draft show on Friday, but he gives me the Romeo Doubs vibes as a player who wins down the field, creates big plays, averages high yards per catch, but doesn't have great time speed. He's a little bit of a bigger, denser type player. Some frustrating drops on his tape as well. So all of that adds up as a player that's in tier 4 for these wide receivers that I acknowledge could be quality role players for Miami, but I don't think they upgrade your wide receiver 3 spot versus the 16 names in total that we had that ranked above the Dolphins' 3rd player. So those are the day 1 and day 2 options. In total, you got like 20 names. It's obscene class from the amount of volume. Like if 1 out of every 5 picks in the top 100 in the first 3 rounds is a wide receiver, I'd be surprised if you got that kind of volume just because it's a good offensive line class. There's some good day 2 options at corner and at edge group and the interior offensive line, who everybody's trying to get a piece of. And you get the quarterbacks early. Like I'd be surprised if you get that kind of volume, but you won't know who slips in for what reasons until you kind of get into it and you see how the board starts to stack and fall. But names that I'm lower on that kind of get projected up higher, like I could see Keon Coleman going before some of the tier 2 guys that I have. I could see Troy Franklin going before some of the tier 2 guys that I have. I could see Jalen Polk going before some of the tier 2 guys that I have. That's the kind of thing when I'm getting into the draft, I'm going to be sitting down, wide receiver teams are coming up. I'm like, pick Keon Coleman, please. Pick Jalen Polk, please. Pick those guys. Pick Troy Franklin, please. Kick one of these tier 2 guys down into our lap at 55 unless they go wide receiver at 21. And we'll have the same conversation with the offensive line on our next show, because that's the deal, right? These decisions are all interwoven. There's opportunity cost with every decision that you do indeed make. Now, we're going to shift gears to day 3. I have a couple of guys I want to shout out, including giving a little bit more love to Malik Washington, who I actually have graded in the 3rd round. So I'm higher than the forecast there for him. Would absolutely gobble him up, although Miami doesn't have a 4th round pick, so you're kind of in a no man's land in that regard anyway. But we'll talk about some of those players up next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. So make sure that you stick with us. I have been told I'm a bit of a competitive person, and I can confirm the sources in that regard. But I do have a competitive side. We all do. And my competitive side is a big fan of Monopoly Go. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's been downloaded over 150 million times. It's a great twist on Monopoly where you play not one, but hundreds of Monopoly boards in crazy locations, building up amazing cities that bring you big money. But the best part is just messing with my friends. I could charge them rent on my iconic properties, just like classic Monopoly, but now I can also rob their vaults of riches for myself. But it's not just my competitive side that loves it. You could team up with friends and people around the world in timed tournaments to earn huge rewards. So get in the game and join your friends. Download Monopoly Go now for free on the App Store or Google Play. Playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. It's $150 win or lose bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks. Famos got those, by the way, all on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Day 3, guys, I want to give a little bit of love to. I think it would make a lot of sense for Miami in specific roles. Jordan Whittington is my 24th ranked wide receiver. So he is the lowest player that I have done. I have a 5th-round grade on him. And just to get all 200-plus players that I'm doing for the draft done, I had to stop wide receivers. I'm like, okay, I'm into the 5th round. There's going to be guys that are going to be later than that get drafted as well. But it's a marathon getting these wide receivers done. So Jordan Whittington is technically the last wide receiver that I have graded. I have a 5th-round grade on him from the University of Texas. Unheralded player. He's the 3rd wide receiver in Texas. So you go with Jonathan Brooks at wide receiver. Or at running back, You go with Jatavian Sanders at tight end. You go with A.D. Mitchell and Xavier Worthy. And then there's Jordan Whittington. He's at best the 5th option in the offense for Quinn Ewers. And this is a guy who I think is going to have a Mac Hollins-esque career. He doesn't quite run as well as Mac, but he's a big physical X. Like, if you wanted to get Brendan Rice and you struck out on day 2 because he goes a little earlier than what you're comfortable with drafting, come back and get Jordan Whittington later. Texas did some really neat stuff with him. They put him in the backfield. They gave him some scheme touches. They put him on the point, let him block. He was the underneath player in a lot of run after catch opportunities, and his physicality really showed up in a big way. He's got good ball skills. I think he'll be a special team staple for somebody. That's a guy, if you want the big body type, right? Because if we work our way through, I would put Harrison in the big body type. I'd put Legette in the big body type. I'd put Brian Thomas in the big body type and A.D. Mitchell in the big body type. Keon Coleman, kind of the tall, long guys. Then Brendan Rice. You strike out on all those guys all throughout, but that's the kind of receiver you want. Get Jordan Whittington late on day 3. I want to give him a little bit of love. The day 3 slot shifty, can win with the ball in his hands, can create underneath separation, maybe undersized guy that runs really well. That pops to me a lot is Jacob Cowing from Arizona. He's another one of these 5'9" wide receivers, right? So you put him in the bucket with guys that you wish were a little bit bigger. Malik Washington is certainly a part of that conversation. Xavier Worthy. I wouldn't typecast as just the vertical player. I think he does win enough underneath and with the ball in his hands to justify being a part of that conversation. Is kind of the upper echelon player of that type. This is somebody who ran in the high 4.3s, but he's 5'9", like 190. Another not big body type for wide receiver room that needs some different flavors to it. But if you wanted to kind of have an insurance policy that can do some of the things and also has the time speed that you're looking for, Cowing makes a lot of sense. A lot of kind of whip and return routes, things that rely on the short area agility because he's so compact to the ground. He does those really well. That's somebody I think could actually push. I have him graded right next to Braxton Berrios on the vertical board. at wide receiver. So I think that's some competition for Braxton Berrios, who, of course, is back on a one-year deal if they wanted to go wide receiver later in the draft. I put Malik Washington in that same bucket. I just think he's got a little extra in the way of leaping ability, high pointing the football. Even though he's also a small player, I think he's got a little bit of a bigger catch radius. I think he's more physical after the catch. So he's just got some more layers to his game, I think, than Cowing does as far as like the Berrios threat. But I also have Washington ranked above Berrios, and I have him ranked above Ezukama. So Ezukama grades out as the third wide receiver right now. Washington definitively, I think, could come in and be the third wide receiver right off the jump based off the depth chart the Dolphins currently have. So that's a little bit more about me being high on him than anything else. If you want the day 3 field stretcher type explosive play, I would put Neighbors. Neighbors has a little bit more run after catch to his game too. If you wanted to put some of Xavier Worthy in this bucket, if you wanted to put Brian Thomas in this bucket, if you wanted to get into Tez Walker and Troy Franklin as the tier 4 guys that are in this bucket, the day 3 guy that jumps off to me is Jamari Thrash from Louisville. Runs well, much more of a vertical plane receiver. I think his separation comes in the vertical plane. The diversity of the route tree is not quite there in the same way that I think even some of the other guys that I think are a little bit more limited in what they do in all dimensions, which makes them a little one-dimensional for Miami. Again, you go all the way up the pecking order of Brian Thomas, and that's the kind of concern I have with him is how diverse of a menu can you have right off the jump for Miami. So in total, I did 24 wide receivers. Tier 1 is the untouchables for the Dolphins. It's going to be Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, and Rome Odunze. Tier 2, I'm way high on Ricky Pearsall and Xavier Legette. Those are the top of tier 2 guys for me. You see a lot of mock drafts that have them falling in the early to mid-second round. I expect Legette specifically is going to have a higher demand in real life than that. Maybe Ricky makes it to you. I think that makes it a very interesting conversation if he does. But those are guys I'm higher on that we should be rooting for guys below them in the rankings to go before them so that it gives you the chance. Ricky Pearsall, wide receiver 4, Xavier Legette, wide receiver 5, Ladd McConkey, wide receiver 6, Roman Wilson, wide receiver 7, Xavier Worthy, wide receiver 8, Jermaine Burton with an asterisk for off-the-field questions at wide receiver 9, Brian Thomas at wide receiver 10, A.D. Mitchell at wide receiver 11. Those are all top 10, first round, early second round grades. Like I like all these players. It's just an acknowledgement of how good of a tailored fit for everything the Dolphins do offensively are you. Then you get down into tier 3. It's Malachi Corley's wide receiver 12, Malik Washington, wide receiver 13, Jalen McMillan, wide receiver 14, Keon Coleman, wide receiver 15, Jalen Polk, wide receiver 16. If you were to include Dolphins receivers, Eric Ezukama would be next on the list at the end of tier 3. Then tier 4 is Tez Walker, UNC, at wide receiver 17, Brendan Rice, wide receiver 18, Troy Franklin, wide receiver 19, Javon Baker, wide receiver 20. And then tier 5, Cornelius Johnson, is much more of the big-bodied X type player, good height, weight, speed player, but as far as the route tree, it's pretty limited. That's wide receiver 21's day 3 grade. Then Jacob Cowing, wide receiver 22, Jamari Thrash, wide receiver 23, Jordan Whittington, wide receiver 24. 24 receivers graded, none lower than a 5th-round grade. It's outstanding class. Use that to fuel your arguments for whether or not you think Miami should go wide receiver early, or if Miami should go wide receiver late, or if Miami should go wide receiver not at all. Again, I'm Switzerland here. I want good players. I'm telling you, there's good players and a lot of them at wide receiver. What you choose to do with that for what you think the tailor-made path is for success for Miami in this year's draft, that's up to you. We're going to continue to present all of the information and let you continue to make decisions for yourself. I'll just give you my perspective on how things stand. And then at the very end, I'll tell you what I think. And that'll come like in 10 days on Wednesday. So you have that to look forward to. Our next show, 31 offensive linemen plus 11 Miami Dolphins offensive linemen graded, a total of 42 offensive linemen. We're getting into those rankings. Maybe not as deep as we got into these because it's almost twice as many names. But we'll keep you coming back for more, hopefully, here on Locked On Dolphins because it is your team every day. I appreciate you guys checking out the show. Make it a great rest of your day. I'm out of here. Fins up.